I wasn't in a good place that fall, and that's the cleanest way I knew to say it, without pretending I had a grand tragedy no one else had ever carried. I was 42, worked diesel days and half nights, and had the kind of hands that never fully came clean no matter how long you scrubbed at the sink. Grease sat in the lines of my knuckles like old ink. So did regret. My marriage had ended in the slow, tired way things end when two people keep missing each other by inches until the inches become miles, and my son Levi had started sounding polite with me on the phone, which was worse than angry. Angry meant heat. Polite meant distance. He was 12 and already learning how not to expect much, and I had helped teach him that without meaning to. After the divorce, I told people I moved up behind my dad's old garage for the quiet. That was the line. Folks nodded at it, because men my age are allowed to want quiet, especially if they've been through something. The truth was less dignified. The house I rented below town had rooms that echoed in a way I couldn't stand, and every sound in there reminded me of who wasn't in it. So I hauled my service trailer up to the ridgetop lot behind Ridgeline Garage, where my father had spent 30 years fixing logging rigs, ranch trucks, and whatever else coughed its way up Cedar Ridge with steam coming off the hood. He'd been gone 3 winters. The garage had been closed almost as long. The signs still hung crooked over the bay doors. Blue paint faded to a tired grey, and each morning it looked like a place holding its breath. The trailer itself was no kind of home, but it was honest. A narrow bunk, a 2-burner stove, 1 dented coffee pot, a heater that clanged like a dropped socket when it kicked on, and enough floor space for Brisket to curl up by the door. Brisket was an old red heeler with 1 ear that stood straight and 1 that flopped halfway over like it had changed its mind years ago and never revisited the matter. He had arthritis in his back hips and still tried to herd my boots when I came in after shift. He also had better emotional instincts than I did. If I sat too long staring at nothing, he'd stand up, lean his weight against my shin, and exhale like a blacksmith bellows until I either scratched his neck or got up and moved. That dog kept me tied to routine when I didn't trust my own head. My days started before dawn at Hensley Fleet down in the valley. I handled heavy diesels, municipal plows, feed trucks, tree service rigs, and county maintenance units when they rolled in during storm season with bent tie rods and frozen brake lines. It was practical work, measurable work. A truck either started or it didn't. A seal either held or it leaked. You could diagnose a knock, pull the right part, talk to spec, and send a machine back into the world better than it arrived. People call that blue-collar life simple when they don't understand it. There was nothing simple about lifting 40 pounds of rusted assembly by headlamp, while sleet hissed against corrugated roof metal. There was also nothing abstract about it. That mattered to me because the rest of my life had turned abstract. Why did I miss that call? Why didn't I answer the text right away? Why did 1 late promise become 3, then 7? Every Thursday after shift, rain or dry, I drove my battered shop truck up to Cedar Ridge Overlook and parked nose out toward the valley. It had become ritual by accident and then obligation by repetition, the way habits do when you're not paying attention and suddenly realize they're keeping you upright. I'd bring black coffee in a steel thermos, sit on the tailgate with my jacket zipped to my throat, and look down at the town lights beginning to poke through dusk like tiny weld sparks. I replayed old conversations there because I could hear them better when there was wind in the pines. I replayed the voicemail from Levi's school band director where she said, "Just checking if you got the updated schedule," in that careful tone adults use when they suspect a parent might not show. I replayed my ex-wife Mara saying, "He needs consistency, Clay, not speeches," and I had no defense for it because she wasn't wrong. By the second week of November, the cold moved in mean and early, and old-timers started calling it the Widowmaker Freeze. They always named weather up here like it was a man with a personality and grudges. Normally, I would have rolled my eyes at that kind of talk. At the shop, we trusted barometric forecasts, tyre compounds, and road reports, not folklore. But that year, the pattern lived up to the name in practical terms that made a mechanic pay attention. Daytime thaw softened the shoulders into slick mud, then sunset locked every bend in black ice, and the switchback down Cedar Ridge turned into a narrow test of traction and timing. Vehicles came in with scuffed sidewalls, bent rims, and drivers wearing that embarrassed expression people get when they survive a mistake and don't want to discuss it. I started carrying extra chains in my bed and keeping a canvas roll of winter tools under the back seat. Preparation felt like control, even when it wasn't. The first time I went up on a Thursday and came back down with a flat, I blamed myself. I had clipped a shard of old shale near the overlook, likely, and the rear passenger tyre was hissing by the time I reached the trailer lot. I changed it under my work light in numb fingers, muttered at a stuck lug, and went to sleep annoyed. The second Thursday, same corner of the lot, same tyre went soft before midnight. I told myself the rim had a hairline crack and made a note to swap it on Saturday. Third Thursday, same problem again, except this time I was so worn out I sat there with the jack handle in my hand and laughed once, a short, dumb sound into the dark, because at some point a man has to admit he's being personally corrected by a wheel. I actually said, "All right, you win," to the truck, which is not a thing a grown mechanic should confess unless he's beyond pretending he has his life sorted. I wasn't drinking. I wasn't blacking out. I want that clear. My sleep was ragged, but my mind was still mine. What unnerved me wasn't the repeated flats by themselves. It was the way everything around them felt too orderly. The lug nuts came loose cleanly when they should have been cross-bitten from my hurry. The jack I kept in its bracket under the bench seat seemed to settle back into place each morning with less grit on it than I ever managed. Brisket, who barked at coyotes, delivery vans, and one suspicious mailbox near mile marker 12, would sit by the rear wheel with his tail thumping and watch the tree line as if waiting for a friend who was running late. He never growled. Not once. He just watched, calm as old wood. At work, I tried to keep my mouth shut about it, but fatigue loosens discretion. One Friday, while I was talking a hub on a county plough, my co-worker Nate leaned in and said, "You look like you lost a fight with your own pillow." Nate was younger than me by 10 years and built like he could bench press a transfer case. He meant well in the blunt way shop men mean well. "Pillow fought dirty," I said. "You getting any sleep up there?" "Enough." He wiped his hands on a rag and looked toward the bay door where sleet streaked the glass. "Road's getting bad. You should come down and crash on my couch a few nights. Jenna won't care." "I'm fine." "That your final answer, Holloway?" "Yeah." He held my stare for a second, then nodded once. "All right, but if your truck eats another tire, maybe stop parking on whatever cursed nail patch you found." I gave him a half smile and told him I'd rotate my bad luck to the front axle. We both laughed, and that was that, but his offer sat with me the rest of the day because kindness can feel heavier than criticism when you're already carrying too much. Levi called that Sunday afternoon while I was sorting old sockets in my dad's back office, a room that still smelled like tobacco tin and wintergreen hand cleaner. The fluorescent tube overhead flickered, then steadied, and I answered on the second ring like a man trying to look casual in an empty room. "Hey, bud." "Hey, Dad." A pause. Papers shifting on his end, maybe homework. "Mum said you moved up to Grandpa's garage." "Yeah, just for now." "Is it cold up there?" "Little bit. Heater works, though. Brisket keeps stealing my blanket, so I got built-in insulation." He laughed softly, and I held on to that sound. You still coming down Tuesday? For your practice run? Yes, I wrote it on the dash. You can write stuff and still not come. He said it plain. No sharp edge, just fact. I leaned against my father's old desk and stared at a rust ring where a coffee cup had lived for years. You're right, I said. I can. I have before. I'm working on not doing that anymore. Another pause, longer this time. Okay. Okay. When we hung up, I sat in that chair until my coffee went cold. I kept looking at my hands like maybe they belonged to a man who was better at this than I had been. They didn't. They were just mine. Strong for bolts, clumsy for people, improving slower than I wanted. That night, the wind came hard over the ridge and tapped cedar limbs against the trailer skin in a patient, a rhythmic pattern that sounded almost like someone knocking and then changing their mind. Brisket slept with his head on my boot. I lay awake listening to the heater click on and off, and thought about how machines fail in predictable ways, while families fail in quiet ones you don't notice until you're standing in the aftermath, naming broken parts too late. Outside, the freeze settled over mud and gravel and turned the lot into silver glass. Inside, I made one clean promise in the dark where no one could hear it but me. If Levi called, I would answer, and if he asked me to show up, I would be there, even if the mountain tried to keep me. I lay there another hour after that promise, watching the thin orange heater coil glow and fade, like the trailer was breathing around me. Brisket twitched in his sleep and kicked once against the mat. Outside, cedar boughs scraped the aluminum skin in slow strokes, and every now and then, a little shower of frozen needles slid off the roof with a dry hiss. I got up before dawn, not because I was rested, but because staying horizontal felt like surrender. The lot behind the garage had gone slick in the night. My boots skated a half-inch before finding purchase, and the cold came straight through denim and into my knees. Ridgeline Garage looked ghost-pale in that pre-sun light, the old service bays shuttered, the cracked windows holding a weak reflection of pines and fog. Dad had always been first to roll up doors, first to kick the coffee pot on, first to wave somebody into Bay 2. I stood there with my thermos steaming in my hand and could almost map his mornings by muscle memory. Air hose on the hook, radio on low. Ledger opened. Then the memory moved and there was only me again. One man in a frozen lot talking to a building like it might answer back. "Morning, old man," I said anyway. Brisket came up beside me and leaned his shoulder against my shin. I scratched behind his good ear and watched a pair of ravens cut across the ridge road, black shapes against a sky still deciding whether to brighten. The world looked cleaned down to bone. Frost webbed the chain-link fence. Ice glazed the ruts where trucks used to line up. Even the silence had texture, thick and padded, like a heavy quilt laid over everything sharp. I put in a half day at Hensley Fleet and left, with my back tight and my head full of talk specs and cancelled conversations. Around noon, Nate caught me at the parts cage while I was checking inventory tags. "You still heading up there tonight?" he asked. "Thursday, same as always." He nodded toward the sleet tapping the skylights. "Widowmaker's setting in early. Don't get stubborn on me." "I'm not stubborn," he snorted. "You argue with seized bolts and weather systems like they owe you money. That's not stubborn. That's vocational commitment." He laughed and tossed me a boxed filter. "Well, mister, commitment. Keep your phone charged." That was the whole exchange, maybe 30 seconds, but it followed me all the way up the ridge after shift. Headlights carved a narrow tunnel through mist. Every turn had that dark, wet sheen that meant black ice could be anywhere, and my steering wheel stayed in a two-handed grip the whole climb. Brisket sat alert in the passenger seat, nose near the cracked window, breathing in cold resin and old snow. By the time I pulled into Cedar Ridge Overlook, the last of the daylight had gone blue and thin. I parked in my usual spot, nose facing valley, tires straight, engine idling an extra minute while the heat bled out of the vents. Then I killed the ignition and let the quiet settle. That overlook had a split-rail fence, a warped information board no one read, and a drop that opened all the way to town lights 20 miles out. On clear nights you could pick out the highway snake and the mill stacks. On fog nights like this one, you saw almost nothing below and everything close. Pine trunks, the guardrail, the steam of your own breath. I drank coffee off the tailgate with both hands wrapped around the lid cup and felt that old ache in my chest start up right on schedule. Alone is a strange thing. There's the kind you ask for, and there's the kind that finds you anyway. Up there, I had both. I had enough quiet to hear little sounds, the click of cooling metal under the hood, Brisket's tags tapping his collar ring, sleet grains rattling through dry grass by the fence. I also had enough quiet to hear myself think, in a voice I didn't much trust. I told myself I was here to clear my head. I told myself this is what men do when life gets tangled. Find a high place, sit still, sort it out. But the truth sat closer to the bone. I was keeping company with my own failures because they felt familiar. And familiar can start to feel safe even when it hurts. I kept replaying Levi saying, "You can write stuff and still not come." Present tense in my skull, you can. You still do. I stared out over that fogged valley and thought, I am a man who can rebuild a fuel system blindfolded and still miss the 1 hour that matters. I am a father with good intentions and lousy attendance. I am trying. I am late. I am trying anyway. By the time I took another swallow of coffee, my eyes stung from cold and maybe from something else. Brisket jumped down first, did a stiff-legged circle on the gravel, then trotted toward the edge of the lot and stopped. No bark, no hackles, just standing there with his body easy, head tilted toward the trees east of the overlook. He wagged once, slow and steady, like he'd spotted a neighbor walking up the drive. "You see a rabbit, old man?" I asked. He didn't move. I came down off the tailgate and listened. Usually at that hour I'd hear the little night noises start up in layers. Jays complaining before roost, squirrels trash-talking from branch forks, the occasional coyote yip down in the draw. That evening, the ridge held still. In a way I felt in my teeth. Not dead, not empty, just attentive. Even the wind seemed to step lighter through the pines. I waited for unease to hit. It didn't. What came instead was alertness, the same kind I got when an engine changed pitch just half a note and I knew something mattered even before I named it. A mule deer doe slipped out from the brush beyond the fence, crossed the turnout 30 yards from us, and kept going toward the creek cut without a startle or rush. Brisket watched her like he was watching a slow parade. He gave a soft woof through his nose, then sat down square and calm. If he had felt threatened, he would have told me. He had opinions about everything. Mail trucks, squirrels, wind-blown trash bags. He did not waste silence. I stayed until my coffee went cold and my fingers ached through gloves. On the drive back to the garage lot, I felt that odd stillness ride with me. Not heavy, not menacing, just present. When I parked behind Bay 3 and shut down, the rear passenger side looked a little low again. I crouched with my flashlight. Sidewall was soft, not blown, but low enough to need changing before morning if I meant to get down safely for work. I had all the tools right there. I also had no energy left in me worth naming. "You picked a bad night, buddy," I muttered to the truck, then gave my own words a tired half-laugh. "Not you, Brisket. You're perfect." He sneezed like disagreement and followed me into the trailer. I set my alarm early, planning to swap the tire before dawn. The heater clanged, the wind pressed and released, and sleep came in short, broken strips. When the alarm went off, the windows were silvered with frost from inside. I shoved on boots, grabbed the headlamp, and stepped out expecting 20 minutes of cold knuckles and lug-wrench leverage. Brisket trotted ahead, tail already working. He went straight to the rear wheel and sat. The tire was mounted, fully seated, pressure right by eye. The truck sat level. I stood there with the wrench in my hand and stared. My spare was no longer in the bed bracket. It was on the hub. The old tire leaned upright by the fence, not tossed, not dropped, just set there cleanly like somebody had finished a job and respected the space enough not to leave a mess. Even the jack, which I kept caked with road grit because I was always in a hurry, was back in its slot under the bench seat, wiped almost clean. I crouched and put a gloved hand on the rim. Cold as creekstone. No heat from recent work. Whoever did it had done it hours ago, while I was dead to the world 10 yards away. My first practical thought was Nate messing with me, but Nate slept like a sane person and lived 30 minutes in the wrong direction. Second thought, drifter. Maybe someone needing goodwill karma. Third thought, maybe I'd changed it and forgot. That one didn't hold for even 5 seconds. I might lose track of bills, calls and sleep, but I do not perform wheelwork in a blackout and then neatly stage the removed tire by my fence. Brisket thumped his tail against frozen mud and looked toward the tree line behind the old oil shed. He wagged in that same slow rhythm as the overlook, then glanced back at me as if to ask whether I was finally paying attention. That was when I saw the stones. On the truck hood, right above the emblem, somebody had laid 4 smooth creek stones in a tidy cross, not random gravel from the lot. River-worn, flat, grey-blue stones that would have come from lower water, where the current does the polishing. Centered, deliberate. No note, no scratches. Just that quiet little shape sitting on cold metal under a dim wash of dawn. I didn't touch them at first. I just stood there with my headlamp still on, beam cutting a white bar through mist, and felt the same thing I felt at the overlook, the ridge watching without pressure. The morning birds had started by then, but softly, one call at a time, not the usual racket. A chickadee landed on the fence post 2 feet from the removed tire, cocked its head, and stayed put. "Okay," I said to no one in particular. "I see this." Brisket got up, padded to the hood, and sniffed the stones once. Then he licked my wrist and leaned into my leg until I exhaled. I stopped trying to dismiss it and started trying to understand it right there in the frost. Before I went back inside, I marked a lug nut with white paint, locked the jack compartment, and set the valve stem at 6 o'clock as a reference point, because mechanics trust repeatable patterns more than gut feelings. That dawn with the cross on my hood wasn't the start of the pattern. It was the dawn the pattern turned deliberate, and the moment I learned that whatever had entered my life up on that ridge moved through it with care. I stood there another minute with my hand on the cold hood, then lifted the 4 stones one by one and turned them in my palm. They were smooth as bearings, faintly striped, creek-polished, and clean enough to leave a dark, wet line on my skin where frost melted. Nothing in that lot looked like them. I set them on a folded rag inside the trailer next to the old percolator, then went back out and looked over every inch of that wheel like I was inspecting a customer vehicle before signing my name to it. The lug nuts were seated evenly. The rim sat flush. No scoring on the studs, no hurried cross-threading, no gouge marks from a careless socket. Whoever had done it knew weight, leverage, and sequence. I checked the jack compartment. Lock still engaged. I checked the white paint mark I had laid on one lug nut just before bed. It still lined up exactly where I put it. A thin slash, crossing nut to stud. I checked the valve stem. same position. My throat went tight in a way that wasn't panic and wasn't relief either. It felt closer to being seen by something I couldn't classify. Inside the trailer, I poured coffee and opened an old invoice book from my dad's desk. First clean page in years. I wrote date, temperature, tire position, paint mark status, jack lock status, stones on hood. Then I sat there with the pen held over the paper and listened to Brisket drink from his bowl. The little sounds of his tongue against metal were steady, ordinary, real. My mind kept trying to force this back into familiar boxes. Prank, sleepwalking, some stranger with a fixation on my truck. Every box had a hole in it. I told myself I wasn't chasing a legend. I was tracking a pattern. That framing let me breathe. Grief had been the loudest thing in my head for months, an endless station I couldn't turn off. But for that morning, I had another frequency to tune to. Data, sequence, repeatability. I felt almost embarrassed by how quickly that shift lifted me. Curiosity didn't heal anything. It just gave pain some competition. At Hensley Fleet, I moved through jobs by checklist and kept my mouth shut until lunch. Nate sat across from me at the scarred break table, peeling an orange with grease still in the cuticles like mine. "You look less haunted today," he said. High praise. "I mean it. Yesterday you looked like you were going to challenge the hydraulic press to single combat." He pointed his orange peel at me. "You sleep?" "Some." He narrowed his eyes. "Truck okay?" I chewed, swallowed, and chose the narrowest honest answer. "Somebody changed my tire." He waited for the joke. When it didn't come, he leaned back. "Somebody like who?" "That's the problem. I don't know." He wiped his hands and lowered his voice. "You want me to come up tonight? We can sit out there with lights off and catch your mystery tire fairy." I huffed a laugh despite myself. "If I say yes, you'll bring folding chairs and beef jerky and never let me live it down." "Correct." I looked at the rain stripes on the break room window. "Not tonight, but keep your phone on." "Always is," he said. "And Clay?" "Yeah." "Whatever this is, don't let pride make you stupid." That landed because it was aimed true. I nodded once, and we went back to work. By late afternoon, the sky pressed low and grey over the ridge, and sleet started needling the windshield halfway up the switchbacks. I reached the trailer lot before full dark and set up the way I'd set up for a leak test. Methodical, repeatable, boring on purpose. I dusted the jack handle with dry chalk from the alignment kit. I ran a strip of blue painter's tape across the inside lip of the tool compartment so it would tear if opened. I sprinkled a thin crescent of ash from the fire ring behind the rear tire, where a boot would likely step. I marked 2 more lug nuts with paint. I checked my phone battery, set it face up on the dash, and turned the brightness all the way down. Brisket followed each step like he was supervising an apprentice. When I crouched by the wheel, he sat beside me and pressed his warm shoulder into my arm. I scratched his chest and said, "If this turns out to be a raccoon with technical training, I'm moving." He sneezed in my face and wagged, and I laughed so hard I had to sit back on my heels. It was a short laugh, but it was real. That evening I drove to Cedar Ridge Overlook anyway. Ritual was ritual. The turnout was slick and shining, pines black against a sky the color of old steel. I parked in my usual spot and left the truck off. No radio, no cab light, just my breath fogging the window and the valley lights dim through mist. Brisket hopped down, circled once, then settled facing the tree line. Calm again. Always calm. An hour passed, then 2. My fingers stiffened in my gloves and my lower back started complaining from the awkward angle. Nothing moved except sleet threads in the headlights of the occasional car creeping the lower road miles away. I drove back to the garage lot close to midnight. and stood in the doorway of the trailer listening to the dark. No crunch of steps, no clank of tools, just cedar brushing metal and the heater's uneven tick. I slept in stretches, waking to check the clock, then drifting again. At 4:52 a.m., I gave up and pulled on boots. Frost had thickened on the truck windows. My headlamp beam cut a white tunnel through ground fog as I walked to the rear wheel. The tire had been changed again. Not just changed, finished. The old one leaned by the fence where yesterday's had leaned. Sidewall turned inward, valve, stem up. My blue tape inside the jack compartment was intact, unbroken. The chalk on the handle remained, barely smudged. The ash crescent behind the wheel was mostly untouched except for one broad pressure mark at its edge. Not a tread, not a boot pattern, just a deep oval compression like something heavy had settled weight and lifted cleanly. On the quarter panel above it, road dust held a single print the size of my palm and then some, shaped like a thumb pressed for balance. I didn't call it a handprint. I couldn't make that jump yet. I took photos from 3 angles with a tape measure beside each mark, then emailed them to myself so the timestamp would lock. Practical steps, anchors. When dawn lifted enough to blue the lot, I found one more thing. Under a folded tarp near the old parts cage lay my missing tow chain, the one I'd lost in spring mud and written off. It was coiled dry, hook ends wrapped inward so they wouldn't snag. Beside it sat a split piece of cedar kindling shaved clean and squared, like a marker saying this had been placed, not dropped. I carried the chain to the trailer and hung it on a wall hook. I put the cedar strip with the creek stones on the shelf over the sink. Then I stood there with both hands on the counter and let the odd warmth of the moment settle through me. My life was still hard. Levi still had reasons not to trust me. Bills still sat in a stack by the door with red warnings peeking out. Yet that morning I wasn't drowning in those facts. I was paying attention to something careful, deliberate, and kind enough to keep me moving. By the first week after that, the pattern held. I parked at the Overlook Thursday, sometimes Tuesday too, and if I found a tire low by night, it was mounted by dawn in that same neat sequence. Brisket started trotting ahead of me each morning with the confidence of a dog going to greet a familiar ranch hand. He'd sniff the wheel, glance toward the pines, and wag at empty space. The birds never blew out of the trees in alarm. Deer crossed near the turnout at dusk without that white-tail panic burst. Every living thing around me acted like the ridge had made room for a large, quiet neighbor. 3 days later, sleet came in sideways, and I made the choice I had been circling. I left work early, told Nate I needed to check road conditions up top, and drove straight to the Overlook with a plan to stay hidden and finally see who was doing this. He caught my sleeve before I left the bay. "Text me when you're back," he said. "I will. If you don't, I'm coming up." "That your final answer?" He gave me a flat look. "Yeah." By the time I reached the turnout, dusk had gone soft and grainy with freezing mist. I killed the engine and let the silence come down in layers. No coyote yips, no jay noise, just sleet ticking on metal and the far hush of water in the draw below. I had let a little air out of my rear tire on purpose at the last station, enough to force a change, but not enough to wreck the sidewall. That choice sat uneasy in me, like baiting a trap for something that had only helped me. Still, I needed eyes on it, needed certainty. I settled behind the truck bed where I could see the wheel well through the gap under the tailgate. Brisket crawled in beside me unasked and laid his chin on my boot. His breathing was slow, steady, not the breathing of a scared dog. Minutes stretched, my knees numbed against gravel. The cold climbed through my jacket seams and settled between my shoulder blades. Then I heard it. Not a crash, Not branches snapping in panic, but the soft, measured sound of weight placed carefully through wet duff. One step. Pause. Another step. Deliberate, as if whoever moved out there understood exactly what noise could do to a tense man. A dark shape eased between two pines at the edge of my lights and stopped. At first, my brain broke it into wrong pieces: trunk, shadow, stump, boulder, because the scale refused to fit any category I trusted. Then it shifted forward, and the outline resolved into a broad chest, long arms and shoulders high enough that the lower branches framed it at neck level. 8.5 feet, maybe more. Fur dark with rain, not shaggy wild, but dense and layered like winter hide. It stood angled, not squared to me, leaving space between itself and the truck in a way that read as manners more than caution. I forgot to breathe for a second. Brisket did not. He lifted his head, thumped his tail twice against the gravel, and stayed put. The figure stepped to the wheel well. One hand, massive, long-fingered, careful, found the jack point by touch on the first try. It lifted the axle with controlled force, smooth and unhurried, no jerks. The other hand guided the spare onto the studs with a precision that would have impressed any shop foreman I'd ever worked under. It seated each lug in a star pattern, wrist turning with small, exact motions. No grunts, no show, just work done right. My mouth moved before my pride could stop it. No chance, I whispered. Then, a second breath later, no way. The figure paused, not startled, not defensive. It set the wrench down on the gravel instead of dropping it, and took 2 steps back from the truck. Then it turned its head toward where I crouched. Amber-brown eyes caught the dim light. Calm eyes. Not dull, not blank, just deep and steady in a face I can only describe as old without being frail. It didn't advance, didn't retreat. It held that distance like a line it had chosen for my sake. I wanted to run and wanted to stay. I wanted to explain myself to a being that had never asked for explanation. My chest pounded so hard I could hear pulse in my ears. And under that noise, clearer by the second, was a plain certainty I hadn't earned, but could not deny. I was not in danger. A mule deer doe stepped from the brush beyond the guardrail, crossed between us at an easy walk, and kept going downhill. She did not bolt. She did not even raise her tail. Brisket stood, stretched, and gave the deer a polite glance, then looked back at the figure and wagged like he was acknowledging a co-worker at shift change. The figure lowered its chin once, a small dip, then turned sideways, and moved toward the pines with the same deliberate economy it had brought to the wheel. In 3 strides it was half shadow. In 5 it was tree and mist, and dark again. I stayed crouched long after it was gone, one hand braced on cold gravel, the other still gripping the edge of the truck bed. Sleet hissed on the hood. My breath shook once and steadied. When I finally stood, the tire was mounted true, lugs tight, tools placed in a tidy line by my boot. Whatever lived on that ridge was not trying to own me, scare me, or convince me. It had seen a man stranded in more ways than one and kept choosing, quietly, to help. I stayed where I was until my knees started to shake from cold instead of shock. Then I reached down and picked up the lug wrench it had set beside my boot. The metal was wet with sleet and warm where a hand had just been. Not hot, not magical, just carrying the last trace of work. I checked each lug by feel and gave them a careful pull with the wrench, one after another, because that was the only language my body trusted in that moment. Tight. Even. Better than half the roadside jobs I'd seen in 20 years. Brisket nosed my elbow, then turned toward the pines and gave one soft chuff like he was saying goodnight to someone at the edge of the yard. I looked into the trees where the shape had gone and heard myself speak before I decided to. "Thank you," I said, barely above the sleet. No answer came back except wind through fur and the little ticking of cooling metal, but the silence no longer felt empty. The drive from the overlook to the trailer lot took every ounce of attention I had. Ice glazed the upper switchbacks in thin, glassy strips, and my headlights kept catching that shine that meant trouble if I got cocky. I stayed in low gear, hands at 10 and 2, following my own tracks where I could, and easing off the brake where I couldn't. Brisket sat upright in the passenger seat, alert but relaxed, his ears angled toward the windshield, not the woods. By the time I rolled behind Bay 3, sleet had turned to dry, needling snow. I shut the engine down and listened to the sudden quiet ring in my ears. My pulse was still fast. My fear wasn't gone exactly, but it had changed shape. Fear had edges. This felt rounder, wider. Like standing in a church you didn't plan to enter and realizing your voice wanted to drop on its own. Inside the trailer, I didn't even pull my coat off. I opened Dad's old invoice book, clicked my pen, and wrote until my hand cramped. Time, weather, tire pressure before, pressure after, lug pattern, tool placement, distance estimate, eye color, animal behavior, my own position behind truck bed. I drew a rough map of the turnout and marked where it had stood when it paused and looked at me. Then I stared at the page and realized my notes had shifted from proving I wasn't losing my grip to preserving something I didn't want to cheapen by explaining too fast. I set the pen down, rubbed my eyes and laughed once at myself, low and tired. I just hid behind my own truck to watch a giant change a tire, I said to Brisket. He yawned like this was all within normal operating parameters and turned 3 circles before dropping onto his blanket. My phone buzzed while I was still sitting there in my jacket. "Nate, you back?" I had promised, so I called instead of texting. "Yeah," I said when he picked up. "I'm back." He heard something in my voice right away. "You sound like you saw a ghost." "Not a ghost," a beat of silence. "Clay. I saw who's been helping with the tires." "You serious?" "Dead serious." Another pause, longer. "Was it a person?" I looked at the creek stones on the shelf, then at Brisket asleep by the heater vent. "No, but it wasn't wrong, Nate. It wasn't hostile. It worked on that wheel like a master tech." He exhaled into the line. "All right, I don't know what to do with that sentence." "Me neither." "You want me up there tonight?" I could have said yes. Part of me wanted another human voice nearby, just to prove I still belonged to the same world I had this morning. But another part, quieter and steadier, knew bringing headlights and questions into that space would break something that had only ever approached me through care. "No," I said. "Not tonight." "You call if that changes." "I will." I lay down, fully dressed, and stared at the trailer ceiling while snow whispered against aluminum. I kept replaying the way it had angled its body away from the cab, giving the truck and me room, the same way a good shop hand gives another man space at a bench instead of crowding his elbows. That detail kept working on me. A threatening thing closes distance. This one guarded it. By dawn, my thoughts had moved from what was it to why kindness, and that question hurt in a different way. Kindness can land hard when you've been certain you deserved mostly consequences. By Sunday evening, the Widowmaker pattern tightened again. Warm rain over frozen ground, then a hard drop after sunset that turned every puddle into polished rock. I left work carrying a brown envelope from Levi's band director with the updated winter concert schedule inside. I had asked for a printed copy because my phone calendar had become a museum of missed intentions. At a stoplight in town, I slid the envelope above the visor where I'd see it every drive. Levi Holloway, clarinet solo, written in block letters across the top. proof of a date, proof of a chance. The ridge road was empty when I climbed. Fog sat low between pines, and the overlook looked like it was floating above milk. I parked, cut the engine, and sat with my coffee while Brisket did his slow patrol of the guardrail. The wind shifted hard out of nowhere and slapped the driver door when I opened it. I grabbed for the visor out of habit, and the envelope slipped free, skated across the seat, and vanished into the dark brush before I could pin it. I went after it with my flashlight, cursing my own clumsy hands, scanning wet salal and fern and gravel runoff for 30 minutes, until my gloves soaked through. I found wrappers, 2 old bottle caps, a busted reflector. No envelope, no schedule, no Levi's name in block letters. I stood there bent over, breathing white into the beam, and felt that old failure certainty rise up quick and familiar. Of course I'd lose the one paper that mattered. Of course I'd have to call and ask again and hear that careful pause on the other end. Brisket came and pressed into my thigh, rain beading on his coat, and I rested my palm on his neck until my breathing slowed. "All right," I said to him and to the trees and to myself. "I still know the date. I'll call in the morning and confirm the time." We drove back in silence, windshield wipers squeaking over freezing droplets. At first light, I stepped outside with my headlamp and stopped so fast my boot slid on frost. On the hood of my truck, centered above the emblem, sat the brown envelope dry and flat beneath 2 creek stones, weighted against wind. Not torn, not smeared. Dry. Beside the driver door, under the lean-to awning where snow hadn't reached, someone had placed a neat stack of split kindling sorted by thickness from finger size up to wrist size, enough to keep the trailer warm 2 nights without burning my good cedar. And hanging from a nail by the parts cage, the tow chain it had returned earlier was cleaned again, recoiled tighter, and looped so the hooks wouldn't bite anything. 3 gestures, each one practical, each one aimed directly at problems I had been carrying. I picked up the envelope with both hands like it might bruise. Levi's name was still there. The band director's note was still there. Tuesday warm-up, Thursday concert call, all the times in black ink that looked suddenly like a lifeline. My throat closed. Not from fear, from relief so sharp it almost felt like grief, leaving by force. Brisket sat beside the kindling pile and wagged toward the tree line. Calm as ever, then got up and nosed one split stick toward me like he was helping inventory. I laughed with wet eyes and wiped my face on my sleeve. "Yeah," I said. "I see it." I did what mechanics do when something matters. I documented it. Photos with timestamps, measurements of the kindling stack, close-ups of the envelope and stones. I wrote every detail in the invoice book and circled one line twice. Returned Levi schedule, dry, weighted, placed where visible at dawn. Then I made 2 calls. Nate answered first ring. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said. "And no, you still can't come up here with folding chairs." He gave a short laugh, then heard I wasn't joking. "What happened?" It brought back something I lost last night, something important. He went quiet for a breath. "You're sure somebody's not messing with you?" "I'm sure of 2 things. 1, this is real. 2, it keeps helping." He let that sit. "Then maybe stop calling it when you're alone up there." I looked out the trailer window at the pines and felt, strangely, that he was right. Maybe. My second call was to Levi before school. He picked up sleepy. "Hey, bud." "Hey, Dad." I got the schedule in front of me. Thursday, call time 6:15, right? "Yeah." A small rustle like he sat up. "You wrote it down?" "On paper and on my arm if I have to." A tiny laugh. "Okay. I'll be there." He didn't answer right away, and when he did, his voice came softer. "Okay. I'll look for your truck." After we hung up, I stood in the doorway with my coffee and watched morning light thin the fog over Cedar Ridge. I wasn't cured of anything dramatic. I was still tired, still behind on apologies. Still a man who had to choose showing up one day at a time. But disbelief had given way to wonder because wonder, in the end, fit the evidence better. Whatever walked those pines was large enough to break me in half, and gentle enough to return an envelope dry, stack wood by size, and leave me one more chance to keep a promise to my son. That was no accident. That was intention. And once you've seen intention like that, you don't get to pretend the world is only as narrow as your worst season. I ended the call with Levi and stayed in the doorway until my coffee cooled in the cup and the fog lifted enough to show the first curve of the switchback. Then I went inside and started treating that concert like a brake job on a steep grade. No shortcuts, no assumptions, no excuses later. I wrote Levy Thursday 6:15 on blue tape and stuck it across the dash. I wrote it again on the back of my hand with a paint marker that took 3 scrubs to fade. I laid out a clean flannel on the bunk, checked the truck battery, checked my chains, checked my flashlight, checked the spare pressure twice. By the time I headed in for my partial shift, I was already planning to leave 10 minutes early to beat the freeze line back up the ridge. And Brisket watched me do my little ritual, like he approved of finally seeing me afraid of the right thing. By late afternoon, the weather came in hard, a wet slate sky and wind that pushed freezing drizzle sideways against the shop doors. Hensley Fleet ran full tilt with county rigs, coming in for chains and emergency checks, and I worked with one eye on the wall clock all afternoon. Nate caught me rolling my box shut at 4:30. "You heading straight down to town?" he asked. "After I stop at the Overlook for 5. Need to grab something from the trailer, then I'm going." He frowned at the weather outside. "Don't do your brooding routine up there tonight." "No brooding," I said. "Just breathing." He wiped his hands and pointed at me with a ratchet. "Text when you hit the school lot." "I will." He held my stare one beat longer. "I mean it, Clay." "I know." The climb home was worse than forecast. Rain sat on cold asphalt just long enough to look harmless, then skated into clear glaze where the road pitched north. By the time I reached the garage lot, sleet had started tapping the hood like thrown seed. I swapped jackets, loaded the chain bag, put Levi's schedule in the breast pocket of the clean flannel, and gave myself exactly 6 minutes before getting back in the truck. Brisket jumped into the passenger seat without waiting for permission, stiff in his hips but determined, and I didn't argue. The Overlook was on my way down. 5 minutes, like I told Nate, just enough to look at the valley, settle my breathing, and head for town. The turnout looked deserted and silvered over, the railings shining under my headlights. Wind came down the ridge in gusts that rocked the cab. I nosed in slow, felt the front passenger wheel hit a jagged lip by the rock shelf, and heard the sound every mechanic dreads when he's already late. A sharp pop, then the soft thudding drag of rubber giving up. I closed my eyes once, opened them, put the truck in park. "All right," I said to no one. "Move." I was out in sleet with my work light in one hand and the jack in the other, when a gust slapped the beam sideways and killed it. The bulb blinked twice and died. I switched to the small flashlight from my coat pocket. Weak cone, half battery. Good enough for lugs if my hands stayed steady. The cold hit fast through wet gloves. Brisket stood by my knee, body angled into the wind, tail low but not tucked. I crouched at the wheel and tried to set the jack. Ice under gravel made it slide off point twice. On the 3rd try, my fingers cramped so bad I dropped the handle. It clanged once on stone and skittered under the axle. That old certainty rose up from somewhere tired and deep. You're going to miss it. You're going to call with an excuse. You're going to hear that small pause in your son's voice and know you built it. I sat back on my heels in sleet and put both hands over my face, palms smelling like wet steel and road salt. I told myself to breathe. I told myself this couldn't be how it ended again, not over one tire and one dark turnout, not when the date was written across my skin. My chest tightened anyway. My eyes burned. I laughed once at the sky, a rough little sound that broke in the middle. "You've got to be kidding me," I said into the wind. "I can rebuild an injector pump in February, and I can't get one wheel off a truck I know better than my own kitchen." Brisket pressed against my shoulder until I lowered my hands. When I looked up, the flashlight beam caught movement at the tree line. Dark mass stepping through fog and sleet with that same measured care. Each foot placed like weight mattered. No rush, no threat, just arrival. He came into the edge of my light and stopped long enough for me to register scale all over again. Head high above the hood line, shoulders broad as a barn door, fur slicked dark by freezing rain, amber-brown eyes steady and attentive. He glanced at the wheel, then at me, and angled his body away from the open driver door as if preserving the little pocket of space I still needed to feel human in that moment. "Excuse me," I said automatically, shuffling backward to clear room, and even through the panic I heard how ridiculous that sounded. I moved aside for a 9-foot stranger holding my jack handle like it weighed less than my coffee thermos. Somewhere in another life, I would have laughed harder about it. He set the jack true on the first placement, braced it with a flat stone, and lifted the axle smooth and controlled. No wasted motion. No show. The ruined tire came off and rolled aside. The spare came up and seated clean on the studs. He tightened in an exact star pattern, checking each lug twice with minute wrist turns that looked almost delicate against hands that could have crushed the wrench. Brisket trotted between us once, calm as a shop dog on familiar concrete, then stood near the guardrail watching the switchback below. When the wheel was secure, the big figure didn't step back into the trees yet. He turned toward the downhill road, scanned the first bend, and moved to the shoulder. With slow precision, he began laying a line. Flat stones where black ice glazed deepest. Broken cedar branches pressed crosswise for texture. A visible path hugging the inside edge where camber favored traction. He worked bend by bend for the first stretch of switchback, never leaving my sight for long, pausing every few placements to look back and make sure I was watching. I was watching, I was shaking, but I was watching. Something gave way in me while he built that line. Not fear, not disbelief. Something harder and older than both. I had spent a year carrying the idea that love was promises, and promises were words, and words were the part I kept failing. In that storm, with sleet needling my face and an ancient giant arranging stones so my tires could hold, the framework changed. Care was action. Care was sequence. Care was showing up with cold hands and doing the next needed thing without asking who deserved it. I cried then, standing beside my truck in the wind, not loud and not pretty, just tears I had locked behind my teeth since the divorce finally slipping free, because there was no room left to hold them. I wiped my face with the back of my glove and nodded toward him the way men do when speech would only get in the way. "Thank you," I said. "I'm going to him." He finished the last marker at the bend, straightened, and looked at me for a long beat. Sleet hissed on the hood. The valley below was all fog and distant amber lights. He gave that same small dip of his head I had seen before, then stepped to the side of the turnout and waited while I loaded the ruined tire and stowed the tools. He did not approach the cab. He did not touch the door. He simply stood, watchful and still, making himself a landmark at the edge of my headlights. I climbed in, hands trembling, and started the engine. The wipers dragged across, forming ice. I rolled forward to the first stone marker, then the next, tires finding grip exactly where he had laid it. Brisket sat forward in his seat, eyes fixed downhill, ears pricked. At the first switchback, I looked in the mirror. He was still there at the overlook, a dark, upright shape in mist and sleet, one hand resting on the split-rail fence. Not waving, not signaling for anything back, just present until I was moving clean. By the time I rounded the second bend and looked again, he had stepped off the asphalt into fur shadow. No drama, no chase, no final display. One moment visible, the next absorbed by trees and weather, as quiet as breath leaving a room. The marked stones carried me down the ridge in a clean line through black ice and muddy edges, each little placement catching my headlights just in time to choose the right track. 32 minutes later, I pulled into the middle school lot with wipers squeaking and my heart still hammering. I sent Nate a 2-word text, "at school," then sat for one full breath with both hands on the wheel before going in. The auditorium doors were open. Warm air and band music rolled into the hall. I slipped into the back as the winter concert reached the clarinet section, and there he was, under stage lights, shoulders squared, eyes searching the crowd between measures until they found me. Afterward, kids and instrument cases and folding chairs crowded the lobby. Levi came out in his black shirt with his clarinet case banging his knee, saw me by the vending machines, and stopped like he needed to confirm I was not a trick of bad lighting. Then he walked over, close enough that I could see the red marks on his fingers from keys. "You came," he said. "I came," I said, and this time it was true. Levi looked at me for another second after I said it, then gave one short nod like he was filing the moment somewhere careful, not trusting it yet, but not dismissing it either. Mara came through the lobby crowd carrying a coat over one arm and a paper cup of punch in the other, and her eyes moved from Levi to me, to the wet shoulders of my jacket. She didn't smile, but her face eased. "You made it through that road?" she asked. "Barely," I said. "But I made it." Levi shifted his clarinet case to his other hand. "I didn't miss the high part." "You nailed it," I said. "I heard the whole thing." Mara studied me the way people do when they're checking whether a pattern has actually broken. "He did," she said. "He practiced for weeks." "I know." I swallowed and met her eyes. I'm done being late to the things that count. She held my gaze, then nodded once. "Good. Keep doing tonight." That was all. No speeches, no clean forgiveness scene in a hallway that smelled like floor wax and popcorn. Just a workable sentence from the person who had the most reason to doubt me. Levi rode home with Mara that night, and I didn't push for more. In the parking lot, he bumped my shoulder with his, awkward and quick. "Text me when you get up the ridge," he said. "I will." When their tail lights pulled out, I sat in my truck with the engine idling and sent Nate the same text again, "at school," followed by "made it," then drove back up Cedar Ridge slower than I had ever driven it. The storm was easing by then, sleet thinning into a fine, dry snow that whispered across the windshield. The stone and branch line on the upper switchback was still there in my headlights, each marker exactly where it needed to be. I followed it all the way to the turnout, then to the garage lot, then into the narrow strip of sleep before dawn. I woke while the sky was still dark blue and made coffee on the trailer stove, with hands that shook a little from cold and from the memory of those amber eyes in sleet. I put 3 apples in a canvas tool bag, added a new tire iron still in its cardboard sleeve, and wrapped the 4 creek stones in a clean shop rag. Brisket watched every step from his blanket, tail tapping the floor, like he understood this was ceremony. At the edge of first light, we walked to the overlook. Frost crusted the rail. Mist lay low in the drawer. I found the little crossmark place on the hood of my truck where stones had appeared before, then changed my mind and carried the bag to the tree line instead. There was already a cross there on a flat stump, made from 5 smooth creek stones this time, centered and steady. I set the coffee thermos beside it, placed the apples in a neat row, laid the tire iron across the base, and set my 4 stones at the top, so both crosses touched. Brisket sat down and looked into the pines. I stood with my hat in my hands, feeling faintly foolish and fully sincere. "Thank you," I said into the cold, "for the tires, for the road, for letting me get there." A branch shifted deeper in the firs. Not a crack, just weight moving through needles. He stepped into a narrow strip of pale morning between trunks, far enough to keep distance, close enough that I could see rain-dark fur drying at the shoulders and those calm brown amber eyes on me. He looked at the stump, then at Brisket, then back at me. I gave a small nod. He answered with that same slow dip of his head I had seen twice before, turned, and walked uphill into mist until the trees held him again. No flourish, no second look back. The quiet after he left felt full, not vacant. 3 days later, Nate came up after shift with a box of donuts and 2 thermoses, because that was his way of asking hard questions without making a scene. Snowmelt dripped from the bay roof in steady ticks while we stood by my truck. I showed him the invoice book, the time-stamped photos, the measurements, the pressure notes, the star pattern sketches, all of it. He turned pages without interrupting, jaw working, mechanic brain trying to match evidence to known categories. When he finished, he handed the book back carefully. "I believe you saw what you saw," he said. "That's more than I expected." He huffed. "My granddad used to talk about a ridge hand that helped stranded loggers and never came close enough to spook a horse. I figured it was campfire talk." He looked toward the pines with that same half-loaded expression he had worn for weeks, then finally finished the thought. Maybe he wasn't making it up. We stood there a while listening to Meltwater. He nodded at the shelf through my trailer window. "You telling anyone official?" I already had the answer. No sheriff call, no wildlife report. I drafted an email twice and deleted it twice. I'm not handing this over to people who need proof more than they value peace. He gave a slow, approving tilt of his head. Fair. By the second Saturday of December, Levi was in Bay 1 with me, sleeves rolled, learning how to gap a spark plug on Dad's old farm pickup. The shop still wasn't open, but we had heat in one bay and enough light to work. Brisket supervised from a folded moving blanket near the parts washer. Levi held the feeler gauge like a surgeon and frowned at the tiny number stamped in steel. "So, this little gap matters that much?" he asked. "On cold starts it matters a lot," I said. "Small things decide whether something catches." He glanced at me sideways, hearing the second meaning and pretending not to for my dignity. "You're being metaphorical again." "Occupational hazard," I said. He grinned and handed me the plug. "Looks right?" I checked it and nodded. "Looks right." That afternoon we mounted 2 decent used winter tires from my scrap rack onto his mum's old SUV rims and torqued them together. When we finished, he wiped his hands on a rag exactly the way my father used to and said, "Can we come back next week and do brakes?" Not can I. Can we? One word, huge distance crossed. The calls I had left hanging got handled in plain daylight. I returned the band director's voicemail and thanked her for keeping Levi encouraged. She sounded surprised, then relieved, and told me spring schedule would go out after New Year. I called Mara on a Tuesday evening and asked for a standing Saturday work block with Levi at the garage. She said yes, cautious but willing, and we put it on both calendars while we were on speaker so nobody could claim confusion later. I answered every call Levi made after that, even when I was under a hood, by sliding out and taking 30 seconds to say, "I'm here. What do you need?" Consistency wasn't dramatic. It was repetition. Right after Christmas, I unlocked the front office of Ridgeline Garage and washed the windows from the inside out until the glass stopped looking abandoned. Nate and Jenna came up with paint rollers, and Levi lettered a temporary sign on plywood in block capitals. Ridgeline service reopening, January 3rd. Below it, at my request, he added, "Winter tire checks, free." We hung the sign crooked the first time, laughed, rehung it straight. On opening morning, the lot filled with ranch trucks, school staff cars, and 2 nervous college kids in a hatchback heading over the pass. I checked tread depth, sidewalls, pressures, valve stems, no charge. If they needed work, I quoted fair. If they were safe, I sent them on with coffee. The physical reminders found their places and stayed there. The creek stone cross sat on my workbench beside Dad's talk chart, never moved except when I cleaned. The invoice book went in the office safe in a sealed freezer bag with printed copies of the photo log, dates and notes intact. The emailed files stayed archived in a folder labeled Cedar Ridge, backed up on a thumb drive taped under the desk. The old damaged tires were hauled to County Recycle. The return tow chain went back into active service on my truck. The kindling he had stacked got burned through 2 bitter nights while Levi and I rebuilt a carburetor and argued over socket organization like normal people, rebuilding something together. In late January, right before dusk, I parked at the Overlook again with brisket and a fresh thermos. Snowbanks edged the turnout, and the valley lights came on one by one below the fog. I didn't ask for a sign. I didn't need a repeat performance. Brisket sat facing the trees, tail sweeping slow. A mule deer crossed the road at the lower bend and kept going, unhurried. Birds settled instead of scattering. The stillness was the same as before, attentive and calm, and I sat with it until my coffee cooled. Levi called while I was there. "Dad, you still good for Saturday? We're doing front pads, right?" "Front pads and a brake bleed," I said. "Cool. I told Mom we should rotate too." I smiled into the dark. "You're turning into management." "Don't make it weird." "No promises." He laughed, then said softer, "See you Saturday." When the line clicked off, I put the phone down and looked out over Cedar Ridge with my hands wrapped around the thermos and gratitude sitting solid in my chest, where dread used to live. I never found a tidy explanation for any of it, and I stopped needing one. What I carried was simpler and harder earned. A set of stones on a bench, a son who said we, a garage lit again before sunrise, and the knowledge that the world is larger than our hurt, and sometimes something ancient helps you keep your promises,